and welcome. The Maxx is a 35-issue series published by Image Comics between 1993 and 1998. It was written and illustrated by Sam Kieth, with dialogue and co-plotting done by William Messner-Loebs on the first 20 issues. Alan Moore stepped in as a writer for issue number 21, and he was consulted about the direction of the series following that issue. Messner-Loebs would only do a handful of scripts after this change in direction. Spiritually, the first appearance of the Maxx is in Kimiko Primer number 5 from 1983. The 10-page story in question is Maxx, the Hare, and it follows a mercenary rabbit out to eliminate a target. Really, the only connection between this and the Image series is the fact that the protagonist is named Maxx and he's a bunny. The Izzes also appear much earlier than the Maxx series. They show up within the pages of Critters. Although, again, what they represent in the series is radically different than those early appearances. The Maxx would actually debut in Darker Image number 1 in March of 1993, before getting his own series later that month. This series was part of the second wave of Image titles, which followed the initial success of comic books published by the founders of the company. This second wave included 1963 by Alan Moore, Rick Veitch, and John Totleben, The Pit by Dale Keown, and Wildstar by Alan Gordon and Jerry Ordway, to name a few. The Maxx is an unusual addition to the early Image Comics lineup. The focus of those early Image titles was superhero adventures within a shared universe. While the Maxx did cross over with other Image titles, thus participating in the shared universe concept, it was barely a superhero comic. More to the point, the Maxx was a slow-building character drama with surreal imagery and a conflict that didn't depend on fists or weapons. Sam Kieth's art was also quite distinct in comparison to the flashy, energetic styles used by his contemporaries. It didn't look like artwork one would ordinarily see in a strictly superhero comic. It was a melding of various influences such as Frank Frazetta, Bernie Wrightson, and Arthur Soydam. The female characters looked very inspired by the work of Vaughn Bodie. Kieth himself had spent the prior decade mainly working for independent publishers. Most notably, he inked the latter half of Matt Wagner's Mage series. Afterwards, he created the visual style of Morpheus in Neil Gaiman's Sandman. But, despite these credits, regular mainstream work eluded him. At the time, his most high-profile work was a continuing Wolverine feature in Marvel Comics Presents. This is what brought him to the attention of Jim Lee, who extended an offer to Kieth to publish a creator-owned series through his Wildstorm studio. According to interviews, Kieth took this opportunity because he really didn't have anything else going on. At the same time, he had no idea what he was going to produce for Image. So, as a trial, he did an 8-page story for Darker Image using a character he had previously pitched to Marvel Comics. Then, using various sketches and ideas he had jotted down, he developed the idea of the Maxx series. Although, according to Kieth, he had nothing planned out in advance. It was a story that organically developed through its production. Kieth brought in William Messner-Loebs to help with the plot and the dialogue. They had worked together previously on 2 volumes of Epicurus the Sage for Piranha Press, a defunct imprint at DC. So they had an established working relationship. According to Messner-Loebs, he and Kieth would first discuss the story over the phone. Then Kieth would draw it with notes and dialogue in the margins. Kieth then faxed those pages to Messner-Loebs, who would write the script while the pages were being inked. It was a very detailed Marvel method, with the story mainly written by Kieth, but then refined by Messner-Loebs. Kieth did have final say over the end result, but there doesn't appear to be any disagreements between the two creators about plots or dialogue. Although, they both had different perspectives concerning the meaning of certain elements. Regardless, it appears to have been a harmonious working relationship. At this point, it needs to be mentioned there are a fair amount of elements that are intentionally left open to interpretation. So, take the following as one person's interpretation of the material. Certainly, there may be other interpretations, and they may be equally valid. The only authority on the subject is Sam Kieth, and he wisely tends not to reveal any insights into the material. This ambiguity allows for a discussion, which is the basis for all enduring works of art. With that in mind, let's move forward. The simple bare-bones theme of the series is 4 broken people dealing with trauma, mainly by avoiding addressing their specific trauma. Instead, they go to lengths to justify their behavior without acknowledging the underlying cause. The series is broken up into two distinct parts. Issues 1 to 20 are one story that focuses on Julie Winters, and issues 21 to 35 focus on Sarah Pender. Although one could state the second story is about Sarah and Mr. Gaughan. Along with the Maxx, these are the four main characters that are explored during the entire series. The Maxx may be a very large man wearing a bright uniform, but he doesn't really have any powers. He's tough and relentless, but otherwise, he's just a guy wearing a ridiculous magical costume. The majority of his conflicts take place in an imaginary land known as the Outback, also known as Pangaea. Here he manifests as the Jungle King, the protector of the Jungle Queen. However, this imaginary land doesn't exist in his mind. It exists in the mind of Julie Winters, a freelance social worker who is strong-willed and independent. In reality, the Maxx is homeless and possibly delusional, and for a good portion of the early story, his grip on reality is questionable. He's also known as Brer Lappin and Dave, which is his actual human identity. Brer Lappin may be a take on Brer Rabbit, a folktale trickster. Classically speaking, a trickster can be a hero, anti-hero, or a villain, depending on the circumstances of the folktale. Therefore, as an archetype, the trickster is a multidimensional character. The Maxx doesn't completely fulfill the trickster role. Tricksters usually manipulate circumstances to teach a lesson of some variety. They are proactive, whereas the Maxx is reactionary. However, the Maxx's role is flexible, depending on the needs of the story. Sometimes he's the protector of the Jungle Queen. Sometimes he's the codependent companion of Julie Winters. Sometimes he's a homeless man that tells stories to children. So, like a trickster, the Maxx is figuratively multidimensional. However, he's also literally multidimensional. He exists in the real world and the Outback. This characterization of the Maxx is indicative of the other characters and the story itself, which is multi-leveled and sometimes quite subtle. Julie Winters is the center of the original story. Everything that occurs revolves around her and the dark past she avoids acknowledging. There are three very specific points of trauma that contribute to her character. When she was quite young, she discovered a bunny that had been hit by a car. She took this bunny home and tried to care for it, but it screamed and scratched, slowly dying in agony. Julie's mother took the bunny and put it out of its misery. Also during this period, a family friend, known as Uncle Artie, would visit and tell wonderful stories about the Australian Outback. These stories influenced young Julie to create the Outback in her mind to deal with the death of the bunny. It also reinforced the bond with the bunny as her spirit animal. As a young woman, Julie pulled over to assist someone broken down by the roadside. This led to a brutal, senseless assault. She was left for dead, but managed to survive. After healing from this assault, Julie was driving one evening and saw a man on the road. This triggered her memories of the roadside assault. She didn't consciously attempt to hit this man, but at the same time, she didn't avoid the collision either. After this accident, she hit the man in trash, covering his head with a lampshade that had popped into and then out of her manifestation of the Outback. Unknown to her, this lampshade melded with this man, connecting her, the man, and her bunny spirit animal with the Outback. As a result, this man became her spirit animal. He became the superhero known as the Maxx. Sarah Pender is a young woman with a mother she can't relate to and a father who committed suicide. Her journey is to discover the man she never got the chance to know and to find out why it was necessary for him to leave. She has been abandoned, and this has made her emotionally distant to everyone. As some may notice, Sarah's name for the first 20 issues is spelled with an H on the end, and then for the remainder of the series, it's spelled without an H. This was simply a spelling error. Her name was always intended to be Sarah without an H, but was originally lettered or scripted incorrectly, and it went unnoticed. This was corrected after the first storyline was completed. So, this is one of those elements that gives this series an oddball charm. Mr. Gaughan is the antagonist. For reasons that aren't immediately clear, he is the one trying to get Julie to acknowledge and to deal with her past trauma. His methods are questionable and borderline cruel, which reflects his attitude towards women in general. In a manner of speaking, when Mr. Gaughan abducts Julie, he forces her into his vision of an idealized woman. She is on her knees, restrained, forced to listen and pay attention to his words, all of which is done for her own good. He knows what's best for her. Ultimately, this is Mr. Gaughan exacting power over the object that makes him feel powerless. However, Julie rejects being objectified and being forced to adhere to an ideal. One could view the entire series as the attempted redemption of Mr. Gaughan, as he seeks to make amends for past, inexcusable crimes. However, early in the series, he's still actively committing these crimes. So, the guilt he expresses and the actions he takes contradict one another. Overall, once we learn of Mr. Gaughan's past and the trauma he's experienced, we aren't given an excuse for these terrible acts of inhumanity. We are given a context. Within that context, we have an understanding. At best, that's all Mr. Gaughan can ask for. Not sympathy or forgiveness, but an understanding of the psychopathology behind his actions. Ultimately, we understand why he felt motivated to help Julie Winters. And this is the understanding he eventually communicates to Sarah. Mr. Gaughan is also Artemis Pender, the father of Sarah and the family friend that Julie knew as Uncle Artie. On an extended trip to the Australian outback, he was inspired by the landscape and its people to become a magician. This ability allowed him to access the figurative outbacks that existed in other people's minds. Unfortunately, due to his past, Artemis had a distorted view of women. He took out his anger on random women, assaulting and murdering them. This motivates him to commit suicide in order to avoid his daughter discovering his secret, humiliating shame. Like many of Mr. Gaughan's actions, this is both a kindness and a cruelty. He is a living contradiction to the very end. The Outback, also known as Pangaea, is an area between the subconscious and the unconscious mind. It may also be a parallel to the dreaming, or dream time, as it was known by the Aboriginal people of Australia. According to legend, this is a realm of symbolism, inhabited by ancestors and by heroic beings with supernatural abilities. For the record, Pangaea is the supercontinent that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. It broke apart to become the continents of Earth. As a symbol or a metaphor, it's Julie Winters' entire internal being. Its existence is in danger of fracturing and breaking apart. The most immediate and obvious danger are the Izzes. These eyeless, oval-shaped creatures are likely the embodiment of Julie's traumatic memories. They literally bubble up from the depths of her subconscious, trying to cause mayhem in this idealized, peaceful world. The Maxx appears to attack the danger the Izzes represent. As a result, the Maxx is an expression of Julie's denial and her will to suppress painful memories. At the same time, the incident that created the Maxx is a memory Julie also suppresses. So, in a way, Julie is fighting repression with even more repression. That's a level of self-deception that must create a high degree of cognitive dissonance. The Outback is malleable and its scale is flexible. Therefore, one's perspective is constantly skewed. It's never one thing or another. It's in a constant state of change. This reflects the personality of an individual who is self-aware and adaptable. But, at the same time, it's someone who is denying the traumatic influences that have shaped the person they have become. After all, negative events impact us far more often than positive ones. Our emotional scars enhance our character, even if we'd like to believe otherwise. Ultimately, the Outback has become corrupt by Julie's life experiences. As a coping mechanism, it's in a state of failure. Now, these are the major elements of the Maxx series. There are other bits and pieces that contribute to the whole. To cover all of them would take a fair amount of time. And, quite honestly, some side characters and elements are slightly meaningless or have stories that don't really go anywhere. They are interesting bits of flavor text, even though they aren't an integral part of the main story. The art style also changes and becomes more experimental as the series moves along. There are some interesting artistic choices, which do enhance the sequence being illustrated, and, as an experiment, it's quite successful. As mentioned earlier, the first 20 issues are one story. Then the series moves forward 10 years and becomes another related story. While one could stop at the 20th issue and have a full story, the remainder of the series does fill out some major details not originally addressed. It's worth mentioning that issues 30 to 34 are complete deviations from the main story. It's possible these are stories left over from the Friends of Maxx series that only lasted 3 issues, and, at best, these filler issues are story fragments. 3 separate stories begin and don't come to anything resembling a conclusion. They read like Keith was stalling for time, looking for a way to conclude the main story. Or, possibly, he didn't want to conclude the story and, in essence, the series itself. In what would become the final issue, the main story is finally concluded, with all of the main characters being wiped from continuity. Their experiences and memories are removed, and they're left in a state where they are strangers to one another. It's a very bittersweet conclusion. In issue number 35, Sam Kieth was vaguely discussing the direction that would come next. It may have been that he intended to do side stories, like those seen in Friends of Maxx, before returning to the established characters. Instead, he shot a movie and then returned to comics with miniseries such as 4 Women and Zero Girl. The Maxx series quietly faded away. As a side note, Keith did return to the Maxx with the crossover series Arkham Dreams in 2018. Along with Batman and the Maxx, this miniseries includes the established characters Mr. Gaughan and Julie Winters. Unfortunately, only 3 issues of this 5-issue series have been published. The final 2 issues are solicited for late 2020, so there may be a conclusion forthcoming after a 2-year hiatus. In the end, the Maxx is a moderately dark series that involves some disturbing events. Unlike many comic books that toss out assault and trauma like candy on Halloween, this series takes the time to examine and deal with the consequences. This is one of the aspects that sets it apart from other comic books. It contains intimate portrayals of people, one of whom is a very large man in a purple suit, doing what they can to adapt to life as it continues on. They are flawed and contradictory, and sometimes act against their better judgment. In essence, they are like real people within a metaphysical setting. Yes, some parts are a bit messy, and some resolutions seem a touch abstract, but it does feel complete on a few levels. Any imperfections it may have feel honest and human. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. If you would like to go a step further, click Join and select the option most suitable for you. Any and all support is greatly appreciated. Thank you. That's it for today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment, and I will talk at you later. Until next time.